New York City, the Hotel Statler, 4 in the morning, November 28, 1953. A man goes through a 13th floor window, glass, then air, then the sidewalk. His name is Frank Olson. He is an Army biochemist. There is another man in the room, a CIA-assigned minder, there specifically to watch him, who will later say he was asleep when it happened. 9 days earlier, the CIA had put a drug in his drink without telling him. He didn't know what it was until 20 minutes after he swallowed it. The government called it a suicide and closed the file. It took 22 years, a Senate committee, and a president's own commission to admit the drug was even involved. It took 41 years and an exhumed body for a forensic pathologist to look at Frank Olson's skull and say, on the record, this does not look like a man who fell. We're going to spend this entire series orbiting that window, not because Frank Olson was the CIA's worst crime. He almost certainly wasn't, not by a long way. He's just the one where a body actually got dug back up. Everyone else this program hurt mostly just has to live with never getting even that. Here's how the government ended up dosing one of its own scientists, and then standing around a hotel room arguing about a nap. Start with the fear, because the fear is real, even if what the CIA built on top of it wasn't. Korean War. American POWs come home from Chinese and North Korean captivity, and some of them are saying things, praising communism, denouncing the United States, that sound scripted, coerced. The word brainwashing gets coined for exactly this moment, and Washington genuinely believes the communists have cracked something, a technique for reaching directly into a man's mind and rewriting what's inside it. Nobody in Washington stops to ask whether captivity, isolation, and fear might just do that to a person on their own, with no exotic science required. That's not the story anyone in the CIA wants. The story they want is a secret weapon, because a secret weapon is something you can try to build yourself. So they try to build it. First under a code name called Bluebird, starting in 1950, early experiments in hypnosis and interrogation, run on foreign nationals and defectors passing through CIA hands, barely coordinated, more panic than program. Nobody in Bluebird has a coherent theory of what they're doing. They just know the Soviets might be ahead, and that's enough to greenlight almost anything. In 1951, Dulles renames and expands it, Artichoke. Same basic goal, bigger ambitions, still mostly improvisation. Hypnosis combined with drugs now, tested on people who have no idea they're test subjects. By April of 1953, both get folded into something bigger, something with an actual budget and an actual chain of command. Something CIA Director Alan Dulles gives a new name to, specifically because of how sensitive it is, MKUltra. Quick aside on the name, because people ask. MK was just the CIA's standard prefix for anything run out of its technical services division. Dozens of programs got an MK tag. Ultra was Dulles's own addition, borrowed from the British World War II code word for their most closely guarded intelligence, the actual Ultra program that helped crack German codes. Dulles wanted everyone who heard the name to understand, instantly, that this sat above almost everything else the agency did. He got his wish. Almost nobody heard the name for the next 22 years. 3 days before he signs off on it, Dulles gives a speech to a room full of Princeton alumni. He calls it brain warfare, the next battlefield, the fight for control of the human mind. He frames it as something the Soviets are already doing to us, not something we're about to start doing to ourselves. That distinction matters, because it's the same trick every part of this series is going to show you again and again. Call it defense, and suddenly anything is on the table. The man Dulles puts in charge of actually building this thing is a 34-year-old chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Bronx-born, son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants, a stutterer since childhood, born with a club foot that kept him out of World War II entirely. Caltech PhD in biochemistry. In his off hours, he does folk dancing, and later in life, studies Buddhism and writes poetry. None of that softens anything that's about to happen. We're telling you because it's true, not because it explains anything. This is the man who will run the CIA's mind control program for the next 2 decades. 4 days after Dulles's speech, on April 16th, Gottlieb sits in on something called the Artichoke Conference. The surviving minutes of that meeting say the group agreed they needed, quote, an area where large numbers of bodies would be used for research and experimentation. That's not a euphemism we're translating for you. That's the actual language from the actual document. They mean American ones. That gets discussed at this same meeting, plainly, by people getting paid to protect Americans. Some of the men Gottlieb ended up working alongside weren't new to this kind of research at all. Congressional testimony decades later would name 2 specific figures: Kurt Blome, who ran Nazi Germany's biological weapons program, and Walter Schreiber, who had been the Surgeon General of the Nazi Army. Both men came out of the post-war pipeline that brought German scientists to work for the United States, Operation Paperclip, and both ended up connected to programs adjacent to what Gottlieb was building. We're not going to pretend we know exactly what passed between them and MKUltra directly, because the paper trail on this specific point is thin. We are going to tell you the fact plainly. The United States, building a program to defend against an enemy's alleged brainwashing techniques, recruited men who had run actual human experimentation programs for the Nazis to help build it. Sit with that. There's an entire other series buried in that one sentence. How many of these men there were, what specifically they carried over, how much of American Cold War science was quietly built on people who should have stood trial at Nuremberg and instead got a security clearance instead. We're not opening that whole door today. We just need you to know it's there, because it tells you something about the moral temperature of the room MKUltra was born in. Nobody in that room was asking whether this was right. They were only asking whether it would work. Here's the operating model, and it's worth understanding early because it explains almost everything that follows. MKUltra didn't run its own labs. It ran money through fake foundations, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, the Geschichter Fund, a couple of others with names just boring enough that nobody would look twice, into roughly 80 real institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, 149 separate sub-projects, funded this way, most of the actual researchers on the ground never knowing where the checks originated. You could do CIA mind control work and never once know you were doing it. That's not an accident. That's the design. Think about what that structure actually buys the agency. Deniability, obviously. If it comes out, nobody at the university signed anything that says CIA on it. But it also buys reach, 149 separate rooms across a continent where a person could walk in for one kind of treatment and walk out having been part of an experiment they never agreed to, at an institution that itself often didn't know what it had agreed to either. Nobody had to be evil at every single link in that chain for the whole chain to end up doing something monstrous. That's the part that should actually worry you more than any single villain in this story. Gottlieb also went and bought the drug he needed most of. In the early 50s, LSD barely existed outside a Swiss pharmaceutical lab, Sandoz. Gottlieb arranged for the CIA to buy essentially the entire available supply, roughly $250,000, which today is somewhere north of $4 million. At one point, they discussed buying 10 kilograms outright. That's about 100 million doses for a government agency. In the 1950s, Now hold that number next to the phrase, large numbers of bodies, and you've basically got the whole first year of this program in 2 sentences. One more thing worth knowing before we get to the man this episode is actually about. None of what you've just heard was illegal exactly at the time. There was no law specifically against dosing an American citizen with a drug without telling them, because nobody had ever imagined a government agency would need to be told not to. The program wasn't hiding from the law. There wasn't one yet to hide from. November 19th, 1953. Gottlieb throws a retreat at a cabin on Deep Creek Lake out in western Maryland. CIA Technical Services people, Army scientists from the biological weapons program at Fort Detrick. Frank Olson is there. He's one of the Army's own biochemists, working on how you deliver a biological weapon, which is its own dark subject we're not opening today. After dinner, Gottlieb's deputy pours drinks, Cointreau, for the group. It's dosed with LSD. Nobody's told beforehand. 20 minutes in, once it's already working, somebody finally says, "That drink you just had, that had acid in it." Olson's reaction, by every account, is bad. Not euphoric, not curious. Bad. Paranoid, anxious, unraveling in a way that doesn't stop when the drug should have worn off. Within days, he's telling colleagues he thinks he's made some kind of terrible mistake in his career, that he wants out of the program entirely. He starts talking, according to people around him, about wanting to leave the biological weapons work altogether, maybe leave the country's employ entirely. People around him start treating him less like a colleague having a breakdown and more like a security problem that needs managing. This is the part of the story that should chill you more than the fall itself. A man who knew what the government's biological weapons program actually did, having a very public crisis of conscience about it, surrounded the entire time by the exact agency he was starting to doubt. In his final days, he was taken to New York, ostensibly to get help. The people arranging that help were CIA personnel. There is no version of Frank Olson's last 9 days where the people supposedly managing his care were separate from the people who had put him in this state in the first place. 9 days after that drink, he's in a room at the Hotel Statler in Manhattan with a CIA minder assigned specifically to keep an eye on him, because by now the agency knows he is unraveling and considers his silence a matter of national security, and he goes through the window. The CIA ran its own internal investigation. Here's what it concluded. Gottlieb had gone ahead with dosing Olson, despite knowing, on record, beforehand, that Olson already had documented suicidal tendencies. The investigation's punishment for this was a reprimand, a note in a file. That's the entire consequence, inside the agency, for handing an unwitting drug to a man they already knew might be unstable, and then having him dead 9 days later. Think about what a reprimand even is inside an intelligence agency in 1954. It's not a demotion. It's not a suspension. It doesn't touch your clearance, your salary, or your career trajectory. Gottlieb kept his job. Gottlieb kept running the program. Gottlieb, 3 years later, would be signing off on an entirely new set of experiments on an entirely new continent, on patients who'd walked in the door themselves, looking for help with anxiety and depression. A reprimand is not accountability. A reprimand is a piece of paper that lets everyone involved say, later, that something was done. Outside the agency, the story the public got in 1953 was simple. Troubled scientist, tragic suicide. Nothing about the drink, nothing about Deep Creek Lake. That version held for 22 years, until the 1975 Rockefeller Commission finally said the words unwitting LSD and Frank Olson in the same sentence in public for the first time. The government settled with Olson's family that following year. A quiet check, decades late, for a death they'd spent 2 decades calling something else entirely. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. In 1994, Olson's son Eric had his father's body exhumed. 41 years in the ground, and a family that had never fully believed the official story finally got a legal way to check. A forensic pathologist from George Washington University, James Starrs, ran a second autopsy. What he found: a hematoma above the left eye, a laceration on the chest, injuries that, in Starrs' professional opinion, do not match a man who went through a window and hit a sidewalk 13 floors down and nothing else. He said so publicly. He said it sounded like a man who'd already been hurt before he ever reached the glass. We're going to be exactly as careful here as we're going to be with every claim across this entire series. That's Starrs' conclusion, and it's the Olson family's belief. It has never been tested in a courtroom. The case has never been reopened. Nobody has ever been charged with anything connected to what happened in that hotel room. Both of the men who were in a position to know, Gottlieb and his deputy Robert Lashbrook, are dead now and took whatever they actually knew with them. That's not us being coy about an unsolved mystery for dramatic effect. That's just where the actual evidence runs out. Say the thesis plainly, because it's the thesis of this entire series, and we're only going to say it once, straight, without dressing it up. Nobody was ever punished for MKUltra. Not for Olson. Not for anything that's coming in the next 4 episodes. People died, or had their minds taken apart on purpose, and the men responsible mostly retired, got medals, and died in their own beds decades later. Every institution that had the power to stop this at any point, the Army, the CIA's own internal review, the Justice Department, Congress itself for the first 22 years, looked at it and, one way or another, decided a piece of paper was enough. Frank Olson is this series' first named victim, and we want to be honest about why we're spending this much time on him specifically out of everyone this program hurt. He's one of the only people in this entire story whose body we actually got a second look at. He has a headstone people know the location of. He has a son who spent 40 years fighting to get even this much acknowledged. Almost nobody else in this series gets that. Most of the people MKUltra experimented on don't have an exhumation, a pathologist, or a settlement check. They just have their lives, quietly rearranged by something they were never told about, and no formal record anywhere connecting the two. Keep one more thing in mind going forward, because it's going to repeat. Olson was one of their own, an Army scientist, cleared, trusted, inside the tent. If the program was this careless with a man who worked for the government that was drugging him, imagine, and you won't have to imagine for long, what it was willing to do to people who had no clearance, no colleagues watching, and no institutional reason for anyone to ever come looking for them at all. That's the shape this whole series is going to trace, episode after episode. A program that started out scared of what an enemy might be able to do to the human mind, and ended up doing far worse things to its own citizens than it ever proved anyone else was capable of. Nobody made the Soviets do a single thing documented in this series. The CIA did all of this to itself, and to us, entirely on its own initiative, chasing a threat it was never able to actually prove was real in the first place. Gottlieb walked away from Deep Creek Lake and kept going. 2 more decades of this. Next stop, a mansion in Montreal, a psychiatrist who genuinely believed he was curing schizophrenia, and a technique for erasing a human mind entirely so you could try to build a new one on top of the wreckage. We told you the thesis of this whole series right there in episode 1. Nobody was ever punished for MKUltra. Hold on to that. It's about to get worse. A woman wakes up in a Montreal hospital room and does not know her own children. Not confused about their names for a second, the way anyone might stumble over a word half asleep. She does not know she has children. She has to be told. She has to be shown photographs, like a stranger being briefed on a family that isn't hers. This is not an accident, not a side effect the doctors are scrambling to explain away in a chart somewhere. This is the treatment working exactly as designed. The doctor who designed it has a plan, on paper, in his own published writing, for exactly this outcome. Erase what's there, then build something new on top of it. She came in for anxiety, or postpartum depression, or nothing especially dramatic at all. Ordinary trouble. The kind that sends thousands of people to a psychiatrist every year without incident, and sends them home again a few weeks later, more or less intact. She did not go home more or less intact. Almost nobody who walked into this particular building did. A different patient, a man, forgets how to run the business he'd managed for years. Not the paperwork, the whole skill, gone, like it was never learned in the first place. Another family, interviewed decades later by Canadian journalists, remembers a mother who went in for what everyone around her called ordinary nerves, and came home a stranger who never fully became herself again for the rest of her life. These aren't rare outliers pulled from thousands of successful cases. This is what the treatment routinely did. This is Subproject 68. This is where the CIA handed a man money to see how completely a human mind could be taken apart. His name is Donald Ewan Cameron, and here's the thing that makes him harder to file away than any of Gottlieb's other collaborators. Cameron wasn't some fringe operator the CIA dug up out of obscurity. He was, by any measure that existed in 1950s psychiatry, one of the best in the world at his job. First chairman of psychiatry at McGill University, president of the American Psychiatric Association, president of the World Psychiatric Association. He built the Allen Memorial Institute into something genuinely ahead of its time. An open-door psychiatric hospital where patients could leave if they wanted to, at a moment when most institutions locked their doors and called it treatment. He pioneered the day hospital model, letting people go home at night instead of being confined around the clock. Both ideas were considered radical for the era. Both became standard practice everywhere, eventually, taught in medical schools as basic good sense. He also believed, and this part is worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing as a cover story invented after the fact, that schizophrenia could be cured by erasing a damaged personality entirely and rebuilding a healthy one in its place, from scratch, on his own terms. He called it psychic driving, and he was developing the theory before the CIA ever contacted him. That's a real, documented fact. And this series isn't going to pretend otherwise, just because it complicates the villain. Cameron may well have believed, sincerely, that he was curing people. He may have gone to his grave thinking he'd been ahead of his time, decades away from a scientific establishment too timid to follow where he'd already gone. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it's a different shape of monster than Gottlieb. Gottlieb knew exactly what he was building a weapon for. Cameron, as far as the record shows, genuinely thought he was healing people, and simply never once questioned whether the scale and violence of his methods were justified by results that in the end mostly weren't there. Conviction is not a defense. It might be worse than not having one. A man who knows he's doing wrong can eventually be talked out of it. A man who's certain he's doing good rarely stops on his own. Belief doesn't undo what he actually did to them. It just tells you how a respected man talks himself into doing it, and keeps doing it, for 7 straight years, without so much as a second thought recorded anywhere in his own writing. January 1957. Gottlieb approves Subproject 68. Money starts moving to Cameron through through the same kind of fake front organization we told you about last episode, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, dressed up as a legitimate research funder handing out grants for legitimate research. $69,000 from the CIA specifically, spread across 1957 to 1964. Separately, Canadian federal programs kick in more than $500,000 across a wider window, 1950 to 1965, filed as ordinary domestic psychiatric research. No CIA fingerprints on it at all from the Canadian side of the books. Cameron commutes for this, Lake Placid, New York, to Montreal, every single week for years to run it. Picture that for a second. A man crossing an international border on a regular schedule, going home most nights to a completely ordinary life in a small American town, then driving back into a Canadian mansion to run experiments funded by a foreign intelligence agency neither government would ever formally admit to. Nobody stopped him at that border once for 7 years, because nothing about a respected doctor commuting to his own hospital looked like anything worth stopping. Here's the process itself, and we're going to walk you through it plainly, term by term, because euphemism is exactly what let this go on for 7 years, without anyone outside that building stopping it. Nobody outside ever heard the word depatterning and pictured what it actually meant. That's the whole trick of a euphemism. It's doing its job right now if you're picturing something gentler than what's coming. Step 1. Depatterning. The goal is total erasure. Get the patient down to nothing, a blank slate, before you try to build anything new on top of it. Cameron does this with prolonged drug-induced sleep, barbiturates, antipsychotics, keeping patients unconscious 20 to 22 hours a day for anywhere from 10 days to 60. One documented case ran 86 days, nearly 3 months of a person's life spent almost entirely unconscious, by design, on purpose, as the actual treatment plan written down in a chart, signed off on by a man with a medical degree and a professional reputation to protect. Layered on top of that, electroconvulsive therapy. Standard ECT in this era runs 2 or 3 times a week, carefully spaced, monitored, understood by the field as a serious intervention that needs real recovery time between sessions. Cameron runs it 2 to 5 times a day, at intensities reported up to 75 times the normal therapeutic dose, often using a method called Page-Russell that deliberately extends the convulsions instead of cutting them short the way you'd want to if the goal were actually gentle correction. This isn't a doctor pushing the envelope of an accepted treatment a little too far. This is an entirely different category of thing, wearing the same medical name so it could be billed, charted, and defended as medicine to anyone who came asking. Patients in this state cannot advocate for themselves, cannot say stop, cannot leave, even though the Allen Memorial had prided itself, under this same director, on being an open-door hospital where people were free to walk out. The door was open. The people inside it were, by design, no longer capable of using it. Step 2. Psychic driving. Once a patient is sufficiently depatterned, Cameron's own clinical word for it, meaning stripped down to something close to infantile, unable to recognize a spouse or remember a job, he starts playing them tape loops. Their own recorded voice, sometimes, saying things Cameron wrote out for them to say beforehand, or messages Cameron authored outright, played back for 10 to 20 hours a day, for cycles running 6 to 10 days or longer, sometimes stacked into much longer courses of treatment. Some accounts put the total repetitions across a full course at up to 500,000 times. 500,000 times. Try to hold that number for even 5 seconds and feel what it would actually do to a person, lying there unable to move, unable to leave, hearing the same sentence about who they were supposed to be, over and over, for days that blur into weeks. The idea was that a rebuilt psyche needed something to rebuild itself around, and Cameron decided that something could just be typed up on an index card and played on a loop until it stuck like a nail going into wood. It didn't work the way he wanted it to. It worked in a completely different, much worse way instead, not curing anyone of anything, just leaving people hollowed out where a personality used to be. Cameron published papers about this, presented findings at professional conferences. Colleagues in his own field, reading the same journals everyone else read, had access to descriptions of what psychic driving actually involved for years before any public reckoning began. This wasn't hidden from psychiatry the way it was hidden from the patient's own families. It was hidden from ordinary people. Professionally, it was simply tolerated. Here's a name, because this series names its named victims, and Cameron's patients don't get to stay statistics on a compensation spreadsheet. Charles Taney, admitted to the Allen Memorial Institute for trigeminal neuralgia, a nerve condition, physical facial pain, nothing to do with his psyche at all, nothing schizophrenic or even psychiatric about the actual reason he walked through that door. He got over 50 days of insulin-induced sleep therapy, a rotating cocktail of barbiturates, Seconal, Nembutal, Veronal, Amylbarbital, antipsychotics, a sedative called glutathione, frequent Page-Russell ECT sessions, the kind built specifically to prolong the seizure rather than shorten it. He never fully recovered. Decades later, in 2019, his daughter Julie Taney filed a class action lawsuit on his behalf and on behalf of other victims and their families, seeking compensation for what had been done to a man who walked into that hospital with a nerve problem and walked out, eventually, years later, changed, as something closer to a case study than the person his family remembered. He is one of dozens. Some accounts put the number of Cameron's actual documented patients at around 80. Over 300 people would later come forward seeking compensation from the Canadian government, a bigger number that includes patients, plus family members carrying damage of their own, generations removed from the actual chair Cameron's patients sat in. Both numbers are real. They're answering different questions. We're not going to blur them into one clean figure for you just because one sentence is easier to write than two. That intergenerational damage isn't a rhetorical flourish. As recently as 2017, a family member of one of Cameron's patients, not the patient themselves, their child, received 100,000 Canadian dollars specifically for trauma the government agreed had passed down a full generation. Think about what that acknowledgement actually means. It means the harm was significant enough and documented enough that a government was willing to pay out for damage to someone who was never even in that building. The patients weren't the only ones this program broke. It just took longest to notice everyone else it broke along with them. Cameron died of a heart attack in 1967, still respected, still decorated, president of professional associations that never once revisited what he'd been doing in Montreal while he held those titles. No reckoning found him in life. None was even close to starting. He got to be a legend for a full decade before anyone outside that hospital had the faintest idea what de-patterning actually meant. It took until the 1980s for former patients to start speaking publicly. A Canadian news program called The Fifth Estate interviewed two of them in 1980, the first time most of the country heard any of this in plain language instead of a clinical footnote. Lawsuits followed through the decade. In 1988, 9 survivors got compensation from the United States government. In 1992, Canada set up its own compensation plan, up to 100,000 Canadian dollars per claimant, but only after a government lawyer, George Cooper, concluded there was no legal liability, only a moral one. A polite way of saying, "We don't have to pay you, we're choosing to." 77 survivors got paid out under that plan. More than 250 other claimants got nothing at all. Records lost over the decades, filed too late by people who'd spent years not knowing there was anything to file for, or, in the government's own stated judgment, simply hadn't suffered enough to qualify. Read that back. A government panel deciding some victims of state-funded brain erasure experiments hadn't suffered enough. Then Justice Minister Kim Campbell refused, at the time, to accept any broader liability on the government's behalf, beyond the specific plan already in place. That refusal held for years. Families kept filing anyway, kept getting turned down anyway, and kept trying anyway, because the alternative was letting the whole thing simply close on a number the government had picked for its own convenience. One more thing before we move on, because it's the detail that turns this from a tragedy into a blueprint. Findings from Cameron's work at the Allen Memorial are cited directly in the CIA's own 1963 interrogation manual, codename KUBARK, later declassified in 1996, remembered today as one of the torture manuals. The sensory deprivation techniques Cameron refined on patients who came in for anxiety and postnatal depression didn't stay in that Montreal mansion. They went into an interrogation handbook that shaped how the United States trained people to break other human beings for decades afterward. In rooms and countries most of Cameron's actual patients never even heard of. Follow that thread all the way out, and it gets uglier still. Researchers and journalists have traced KUBARK's fingerprints into interrogation doctrine used long after the Cold War ended, in wars fought well within living memory. A woman committed for postpartum depression in 1959 is, in a very real and traceable sense, connected to interrogation rooms on the other side of the planet, decades later, holding prisoners who never heard her name and never will. That's not a metaphor. That's a documented citation trail. A hospital that was supposed to heal people became a research and development lab for torture. Nobody involved in building it out of that hospital ever paid a price for the transition. Not Cameron, who died first, and not a single administrator who let him keep his title the whole way through. And not one person at the CIA who took what he'd learned and put it directly into a manual with a body count of its own. That's 2 episodes now. 2 completely different men, 2 completely different countries, same exact ending. No charges, no trial, a career that ends in honors instead of handcuffs. Next time, we head to San Francisco, where the CIA stops hiding behind hospitals entirely and starts running actual brothels to drug people off the street. Now we're going to San Francisco, where the CIA stops hiding behind hospitals and starts running actual brothels. 225 Chestnut Street, San Francisco. A perfectly ordinary apartment building on a perfectly ordinary block. Behind one particular door, a bedroom with can-can dancers on the wall, 3 Toulouse-Lautrec posters in black silk mats, red curtains, and a 2-way mirror built into the wall like it was always supposed to be there. The CIA decorated it, personally. A federal narcotics agent picked out the artwork himself, fussed over drapery like a man staging a film set, because, in a sense, that's exactly what he was doing. A man gets brought upstairs by a woman he thinks he's just met at a bar. He doesn't know she's being paid by the United States government. He doesn't know his drink has acid in it. He doesn't know 2 men are standing on the other side of that mirror, taking notes, timing how long it takes him to fall apart, watching him the way you'd watch a lab rat find its way through a maze. He goes home the next morning remembering a strange, bad night he can't quite explain. He never finds out why. Nobody ever tells him. There is, as far as we can find, no surviving list of who these men even were. This isn't a one-off. This is a repeated operation, run for years, on an ordinary residential street, a few blocks from where people were raising families and walking dogs and going to work every single morning without the faintest idea what was happening behind one particular door. The CIA didn't need a secret military base for this. It just needed rent money, a landlord who didn't ask questions, and a country that had, up to this point, no law on the books that specifically forbade any of it. Picture the neighbors for a second. Somebody on that block probably noticed the odd hours, the steady stream of different women, the curtains that never quite opened during the day. Probably chalked it up to something ordinary, a bachelor pad, a bit of neighborhood gossip, nothing worth a phone call. That's the whole trick of hiding in a city instead of a compound. You don't need secrecy if you've got plausible deniability built right into the architecture of daily life. Picture the neighbors for a second. Somebody 2 doors down, watering a window box, nodding hello to a woman who comes and goes at odd hours, never once imagining what she's actually doing for a living, or who's actually signing her checks. That's the texture of this entire program, city after city. Not a black site behind barbed wire, but a rented room on a street exactly like the one you live on. The man running this is George Hunter White, and he's not a scientist. He's a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent, the kind of cop who lives right up against the edge of the law he's supposed to enforce, and sometimes steps over it for fun. Before the CIA ever finds him, White already has a reputation. He'd made his name entrapping jazz musicians in New York through the 40s, including a bust that helped end Billie Holiday's ability to legally perform in her own city's clubs, a career casualty that shaped the rest of her life. That's the resume that gets you recruited into Operation Midnight Climax. Not psychiatry, not chemistry, a demonstrated talent for setting people up and not losing sleep over it. He operates under an alias, Morgan Hall. He runs safehouses in San Francisco and New York, later a spot in Mill Valley too. All of it funded and protected by an agency that has no legal authority whatsoever to be running domestic drug operations on American citizens in the first place. His method is dead simple. Sex workers, on the CIA payroll, lure men back to these apartments. Drinks get spiked. Agents watch and record through the mirror, sometimes for hours, cataloging reactions like field notes. Nobody consents to any part of this. Not the men, obviously, and depending how you look at it, not even the women being paid to do the luring, since, by most accounts, they were told they were helping the government with something important, not told what for, and not told what was actually happening to the men they brought upstairs. White kept diaries, personal ones, not official reports. The kind of thing a man writes for himself, rather than for a case file. Portions surfaced after his death, and church committee investigators who read them struggled, by their own account, to describe the tone in neutral language. He wrote about drinking heavily on the job. He wrote about using the apartment for reasons that had nothing to do with the CIA's mission. He wrote about the whole thing with a kind of open, unembarrassed enthusiasm you'd expect from a man describing a hobby, not a federal officer describing the systematic drugging of unconsenting civilians. Here's the thing about Midnight Climax that separates it from everything we've told you so far in this series. At least Frank Olson had a name we know. At least Cameron's patients walked into a hospital that kept some kind of chart, however badly kept. The men dosed in these safe houses mostly don't even get that much. No systematic subject list survived. Not because the CIA was sloppier than usual here, but because whatever records existed were exactly the kind of thing destroyed wholesale in 1973, along with almost everything else that could have told us who these men were. So we're going to say something we haven't said yet in this series, and we're going to say it plainly, because dressing it up would be its own kind of lie. We can't give you a name this time, not because we're being cagey, and not because we ran out of time to find one, because nobody kept one. An unknown number of American men were drugged without consent over roughly a decade by their own government on their own soil. And the honest answer to how many and who is, we don't know, and neither does anyone else alive today. Sit with that. It's worse than a body count. A body count at least admits the people existed in the first place, that somebody thought their existence was worth writing down. Think back to what the whole program's own founding document said, back in episode 1. They wanted an area where large numbers of bodies would be used for research and experimentation. Midnight Climax is that sentence made literal, made physical, made into an actual apartment with an actual bedroom. Not a metaphor for institutional carelessness, a room where it happened, repeatedly, to men whose names nobody today can even offer you as a starting point for anything resembling justice. Every other episode in this series, we can tell you exactly how many years someone suffered, exactly what drug, exactly what dose. Here, we can only tell you it happened, and that it happened for years, and that the not knowing is itself the last thing this program managed to steal from these men. Not just their consent in the moment, but any chance ever of being remembered as a person it happened to. White wasn't shy about any of this, by the way, not even years later, once it was all supposedly behind him. In 1971, he wrote a letter to Gottlieb, looking back on the whole operation fondly, almost nostalgically. He described it as fun, 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 his actual words, and bragged, in language we're not going to repeat in full here, about everything he'd gotten to do with the government's blessing that would have landed an ordinary citizen behind bars for a long time. Lying, stealing, worse than that. He wrote it the way a man reminisces about the best years of his career, because as far as any consequence ever showed up in his life, that's exactly what these years were for him. Read that letter next to the reprimand Gottlieb got for Frank Olson back in episode 1, and a pattern starts to come into focus that's going to hold for the rest of this series. Punishment, when it exists at all inside this program, is a piece of paper. Reward, when it shows up, is genuine, a career, a pension, a warm letter between old colleagues, remembering the good old days of drugging strangers in a rented apartment. The incentives were never actually pointed at stopping this. They were pointed at making sure it never got expensive for the people doing it. Gottlieb himself asked later, in testimony, about why prostitutes specifically said the whole modus operandi of the operation was built around that structure from the very start. Not an accident. Not a rogue field agent going off script on his own initiative. The brothel wasn't incidental to the experiment. The brothel was the experimental design, approved from Gottlieb's own desk. It didn't stay confined to strangers picked up in bars either. The same basic program tested LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, cocaine, and half a dozen other substances on prisoners, on people in addiction treatment programs who had no real power to refuse, on psychiatric patients already institutionalized and already easy to disbelieve if they complained afterward. One CIA officer is on record describing this exact calculation, bluntly. They made good subjects because they were people who could not fight back. That's not our editorializing. That's the agency's own internal language about who made a convenient test subject and why. Follow the logic all the way through, and it's almost administratively tidy in the coldest possible sense. Pick populations already stripped of credibility: inmates, addicts, the institutionalized mentally ill. Nobody outside believes them if they talk. Nobody inside has much incentive to ask. You get years of research with almost no risk of the subjects themselves ever mounting a case anyone would take seriously. That wasn't a side effect of who they chose to experiment on. That was the entire point of choosing them. 149 subprojects, remember, from episode 1. 80 institutions. And somewhere inside that entire sprawl, a handful of ordinary men who walked into a bar looking for a good night, or who signed up for what looked like a legitimate medical study, ended up, without knowing it, at the exact operational center of the whole program. There's a version of this story where the safe houses feel like the strangest, most cinematic chapter, and the prison and hospital sub-projects feel like a footnote by comparison. We'd push back on that read. The safe houses are the chapter with a decorated bedroom and a two-way mirror, so they're the one that gets remembered. The prisons and psychiatric wards are the chapter with no decoration at all, no mirror, no story anyone thought worth telling at the time, and probably a far higher number of people affected. The flashy version of this program is not necessarily the biggest one. It's just the one with better set dressing. Here's the detail that should make you laugh, if laughing at any of this feels possible by now. Some of the same LSD Gottlieb funneled into these programs ended up through a separate and more conventional study in the arm of Ken Kesey, who volunteered at a VA hospital in Menlo Park and went on to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Allen Ginsberg, and Robert Hunter, who'd go on to write lyrics for the Grateful Dead for the next 3 decades. None of them knew, at the time, where the drug had actually come from, or whose budget line had paid for it. Kesey didn't stop at taking the drug once for a study. He kept going, throwing his own parties built around it, the acid tests, turning a substance the CIA had smuggled into the country for its own covert purposes into the literal foundation stone of an entire youth movement built on distrust of exactly the kind of institution that had put it in his arm in the first place. Ginsberg preached it publicly, evangelized for it, turned it into poetry. None of these men ever knew who to thank or who to be furious at, because the agency responsible made absolutely sure its name never touched theirs. The CIA spent a fortune trying to build a weapon out of LSD. What they actually built, completely by accident, was the opening act of American counterculture, an entire movement that spent the following decade tearing into every single institution the CIA held sacred, using the exact chemical the agency had smuggled into the country to begin with. You could not design a worse return on investment if you sat down and tried. They set out to control minds. They ended up radicalizing a generation instead, and paid for the privilege themselves. The San Francisco operation finally got scaled back in 1963, after the CIA's own Inspector General filed a report recommending it close. Not because of the men being drugged without consent, as far as the surviving paperwork shows, but because White's personal conduct on the job had become, in the agency's own careful phrasing, difficult to manage. Whatever specifically that meant stays redacted in every document that's ever been released, decades later, under FOIA. The safe house fully shut in 1965. New York followed the year after. White retired quietly from the Bureau of Narcotics in 1966, pension intact. Nobody charged him with anything. He died in 1975, right around when the church committee hearings were finally dragging all of this into daylight for the first time. Old age, comfortable, unprosecuted. The exact same shape as every other man in this series so far. Nobody was ever compensated for Midnight Climax specifically either. Not because a program existed to compensate them and turn them down, like Cameron's patients faced in Canada, but because there was never a mechanism at all. You can't file a claim for a harm the government has never officially confirmed happened to you personally. And without a subject list, it never confirmed anything happened to anyone by name. The absence of records isn't just a historical inconvenience for people like us trying to tell you this story 70 years later. It was, functionally, a second layer of protection for the men who ran it. No names, no claims, no case. Compare that to Frank Olson's family, who at least eventually got a check, however small and however late. Compare it to Charles Taney's daughter, who at least had a hospital chart to build a lawsuit around. The men of Midnight Climax don't even get the dignity of a disappointing settlement. They get nothing, permanently, by design, because the design was built specifically so there would be nothing left to hold on to. 3 episodes now, 3 completely different operations, 3 completely different cities, 3 completely different methods. Same ending every single time. Nobody goes to prison. Next time, the records themselves go up in flames. 1973, a destruction order signed at the very top, and a Senate hearing that got told a small fraction of the truth, and mostly, for a while, believed it. Now we're going to show you exactly how they made sure of that. 1973. Somewhere inside CIA headquarters, paper goes into a shredder, box after box after box, on direct orders from the top of the agency. 20 years of files. Every memo about every sub-project, every experiment, every name that might have connected a person to what had been done to them. Gone, deliberately, on purpose, by the people who ran it. Nobody snuck in and did this in secret. The director of Central Intelligence himself, Richard Helms, ordered it. Sidney Gottlieb, the same man who dosed Frank Olson, the same man who funded Cameron's Montreal experiments, the same man who signed off on the safehouses, Gottlieb is the one who actually carries out the order, right before he retires from the agency for good, walking out the door with the fires he'd started still visibly burning behind him. They didn't get caught destroying evidence. They destroyed it and nobody stopped them. Because at the moment they did it, almost nobody outside a very small circle even knew there was evidence worth protecting in the first place. That's the entire trick. You don't need to hide a burn order if the public doesn't yet know there's a program to burn the records of. Think about what that actually means for everyone in this series so far. Every patient of Cameron's whose file existed, every man in a San Francisco safehouse whose name might have been on a subject roster somewhere, every detail of Frank Olson's final 9 days that wasn't already independently remembered by a family member. All of it sat, physically, on paper, inside a government building, right up until the moment 2 men decided it shouldn't anymore. This wasn't a slow, bureaucratic loss of records over decades of neglect. This was a decision, made by named individuals, on a specific timeline, to make sure the truth could never be fully reconstructed. Here's why the timing matters, and it's worth walking through slowly, because it's the difference between these men were exposed and these men chose the exact moment to bury themselves before anyone came looking. By the early 60s, the CIA had already privately concluded the whole premise of MKUltra didn't work. A 1960 internal memo from Gottlieb himself called the results too unpredictable to be operationally useful. Years of drugging people, running electroshock at inhuman doses, tape looping messages into unconscious patients, and the honest internal verdict was, we still can't reliably control anybody's mind on command. The MKUltra name gets quietly retired in 1964. A new one, MK Search, picks up some of the remaining threads. The overall effort winds down through the early 70s, less because anyone inside the agency had a crisis of conscience, and more because it simply stopped producing anything useful enough to keep funding at the same scale. So by 1973, you've got a program that's already mostly over, that never worked the way it was supposed to, sitting inside an agency suddenly very nervous about Watergate-era scrutiny into anything resembling abuse of power. That's the exact moment Helms picks to order the files burned. Not during the program's peak, when destroying evidence might have actually stopped something ongoing, right as the political weather turns dangerous for men who'd have a lot of explaining to do if anyone ever came asking. There's a version of this story where Helms is simply a cautious bureaucrat cleaning house on his way out. Nothing sinister, standard practice. That version doesn't survive contact with the facts. You don't need to destroy 20 years of records covering a program you've already shut down, unless you specifically believe those records would hurt you if anyone read them. The destruction order isn't housekeeping. It's a confession, just one written in the negative, visible only in the shape of what's missing. It almost worked completely. What survived is basically an accident, not a mercy. A 1963 Inspector General report on MKUltra that happened to be filed in a different records system and got missed in the purge entirely. And financial paperwork, receipts, budget lines, the boring administrative trail that turns out to be far harder to destroy thoroughly than the actual content of what the money paid for. Somebody at the CIA, at some point, decided the money records mattered less than the memos describing what the money bought. That decision is the only reason any of this series exists. A journalist named John Marks got hold of that financial trail through a 1976 Freedom of Information Act request and spent years reconstructing what he could from expense reports and grant disbursements, piecing together an entire covert human experimentation program the way you'd reconstruct a burned house from the receipts for the furniture that used to be inside it. That reconstruction is a huge part of everything the public knows about MKUltra to this day. His 1979 book, built almost entirely from those surviving financial scraps, remains one of the foundational accounts of this entire program, cited by nearly every historian and journalist who's touched this subject since, including the more recent books this series draws on. Think about that for a second. The most complete public account of a 20-year, multi-country human experimentation program exists because a private citizen, years later, armed with nothing but a Freedom of Information request and a lot of patience, did the work the government itself had specifically tried to make impossible. Marks didn't have subpoena power. He didn't have a badge. He had a form letter and the law on his side, and it was enough to blow a hole in a cover-up a sitting director of Central Intelligence had personally ordered. We know what we know largely because Gottlieb's team was better at destroying the interesting documents than the boring ones. December 1974. New York Times reporter Seymour Hersh publishes a story about illegal CIA domestic activity, spying on Americans, experimenting on Americans, not framed around MKUltra by name, because Hersh doesn't have that name yet, doesn't even know to ask for it. But it's close enough, and loud enough, and comes at exactly the wrong moment for an agency, already under a national microscope over Watergate, that it forces the government's hand. A presidential commission gets formed, the Rockefeller Commission, led by the sitting vice president himself. The Senate stands up its own, more aggressive investigation, chaired by Frank Church, what history now just calls the Church Committee. Both bodies are, on paper, powerful. Subpoena authority, access to classified material, the full institutional weight of the United States government behind the question of what its own intelligence agency had been doing to its own citizens. And both of them are walking into a records room that had already been mostly emptied 2 years earlier by the exact people they were about to question. That's not investigators uncovering a cover-up. That's investigators arriving after the cover-up already succeeded and doing their best with what was left over. In 1975, both bodies confirm, publicly, for the first time in 22 years, that the CIA and the Department of Defense had run extensive drug and behavior control experiments on American citizens, some of whom knew, many of whom didn't. And they confirmed something we told you about back in episode 1, that Frank Olson's death was connected to an unwitting LSD dose the agency had given him 9 days before he went through that window. 22 years his family spent believing an official story that was, at minimum, incomplete. Now, finally, on the public record, it wasn't anymore. Gottlieb himself testifies before the Church Committee, October 1975, over multiple days, behind top-secret classification that wouldn't get lifted for years afterward. Here's how he handles it, and it's worth knowing because it's a playbook, not an accident, and you're going to see other men run the same playbook for the rest of your life, watching institutions investigate themselves. He tells the committee the program's overall payoff was low compared to its cost and its risk. As many failures, he says, as successes. He frames the whole thing as a disappointing science experiment that simply didn't pan out, rather than what it actually was. A 2-decade campaign of non-consensual human experimentation that killed and maimed people along the way. And when pressed on specifics, actual names, actual outcomes, actual decisions he personally signed off on, he claims not to remember much of it. A man who ran this operation personally for 2 decades, who signed off on Olson's dosing, who approved the brothel structure, who commuted checks to Cameron for 7 years straight, suddenly can't recall the details when a senator asks him directly, under oath, on the record. His own surviving memos, the ones that weren't destroyed, contradict that claimed fog rather thoroughly. Nobody in that hearing room can prove he's lying. Nobody can prove he isn't either. That gap is exactly the space he's counting on, and it works. Consider the position everyone else in that room is actually in. The senators asking questions have the 1963 Inspector General report and a stack of financial receipts. That's it. They don't have the memos where Gottlieb explained his reasoning in his own words, because those are ash. They're cross-examining a man about decisions he made using evidence he personally helped make sure wouldn't exist. It's not a fair fight, and it was never going to be one, because the fight had already been decided 2 years earlier in a records room, long before anyone put a hand on a Bible. Here's the part that should actually make you angry. More than any single individual detail so far in this series, nobody was criminally prosecuted as a result of either 1975 investigation. Not Gottlieb, not anyone who ran a safehouse, not anyone who signed a check to Cameron, not one single person out of every man named across the 4 episodes you've listened to so far. The closest anything gets to consequence, Richard Helms, 2 years later in 1977, pleads to a single misdemeanor, lying to Congress. Not about MKUltra, about an entirely separate matter, covert operations in Chile. He pays a $2,000 fine, no jail time. His own colleagues reportedly raised money afterward to help him cover the fine, treating it less like a conviction and more like a parking ticket that happened to a friend on a bad day. Some accounts describe intelligence community figures treating the guilty plea as something close to a badge of honor, proof he'd kept the agency's real secrets even under oath, even facing charges, and that the community owed him for it, rather than the other way around. That's the entire criminal accountability for the largest human experimentation program the United States government ever ran on its own citizens. A $2,000 fine for a lie about a completely different country, paid for by a collection taken up among his friends. Gottlieb himself was never charged with anything, ever, in connection with any of it. Not Olson, not Cameron, not the safehouses. He went on to consult, travel, study Buddhism, and live another 24 years before dying quietly at home in 1999, decorated with a Distinguished Intelligence Medal the agency had given him on his way out the door. Say the thesis plainly here, because this is the episode where it stops being implicit and becomes the actual mechanism. The 1975 hearings were never designed to punish anyone. They were designed to be seen investigating, which is a completely different thing. Congress got to hold hearings, issue a report, express outrage on camera for the news, and then move on, having produced the appearance of accountability without ever delivering the substance of it. Gottlieb got to control his own story under oath, in a room where his own destroyed records meant almost nobody could contradict him with a document he hadn't already burned. Everybody involved got exactly what they needed from that process. Everybody except the people it actually happened to. Compare this to every episode before it. Olson's family got a settlement, but only after 22 years of the wrong story, and no criminal case ever opened. Cameron's patients got a compensation plan that told hundreds of them they hadn't suffered enough. The men from the safe houses got nothing at all, because there was no mechanism built to give them anything. And now the institution that was supposed to be the actual check on all of it, Congress itself, holding public hearings, under oath, with subpoena power, produced a report, some outrage, and a $2,000 fine for an unrelated lie. Each layer of accountability in this story is weaker than the one before it, and this is the weakest one of all, dressed up as the strongest, because it's the one wearing a suit and testifying under the Capitol dome. One more thing worth knowing before we close this episode, because it's going to matter directly in our finale. Decades later, a journalist named Tom O'Neill, digging back through this same material, alleged under oath before Congress that a key finding, that the psychological effects of these drugs had, quote, never studied, was quietly cut from the version of a report actually handed to Congress back in the 70s. If that's accurate, it means even the limited accounting Congress did get in 1975 was edited on its way to them, filtered one more time before it reached the people supposedly in charge of oversight. We're flagging that as O'Neill's claim, made under oath, not yet independently settled anywhere else in the sources we reviewed, but it fits the pattern this entire episode has just walked you through with almost total precision. Every single layer of this story, every time, turns out to have had something quietly removed before it reached the people responsible for stopping it. 4 episodes now: a dead scientist, an erased psychiatric patient, an unnamed man in a safe house, and a burned filing cabinet. Next time, our last, we're going to tell you what happened after 1975, which, as of a few days before we recorded this, is still actively happening in Congress right now. Here's the part nobody expected. This story isn't over. It's happening again, right now, in Congress, while we're recording this. June 30th, 2026. A hearing room on Capitol Hill. A congresswoman named Anna Paulina Luna, chair of a task force nobody had heard of a year ago, opens a hearing with a sentence that could function as the title card for this entire series. This hearing is about the crimes committed by the Central Intelligence Agency against American citizens. 70 years after Frank Olson went through that window. 53 years after the fire. 51 years after Gottlieb walked out of the church committee having remembered almost nothing. And Congress is still opening hearings on this, still asking, still in 2026, waiting on an agency to hand over what it took. That should tell you something all by itself, before we get to a single new fact. Whatever closure you were hoping this series would end on, the actual United States government hasn't found it either. We built this whole series around the idea that we'd tell you plainly when something was unresolved, instead of dressing it up as settled. This is the biggest one yet, and it's happening in real time, days before we sat down to record this final episode. 2 witnesses sat at that table alongside the sitting congresswoman. Stephen Kinzer, whose book on Gottlieb we told you at the start of this series was one of our main sources, and Tom O'Neill, an investigative journalist who spent years pulling on threads the agency would clearly rather stayed loose. A third man joined them too, and his testimony is the one that's going to matter most for how this episode ends. Here's something we didn't even know when we recorded episode 4, and it came out of this exact hearing. Luna's task force has apparently pieced together the actual mechanics of the 1973 burn in more detail than was previously public. Gottlieb and his team spent an entire day, one single day, destroying 152 files, not over weeks, a day. And the head of the CIA's own records center, the person whose literal job it was to prevent exactly this, objected in writing at the time and was overruled anyway. Gottlieb didn't stop with the agency's copies either. His own personal papers were destroyed separately, afterward, closing the last door anyone might have used to check his account against his own words. Luna's own words for it, on the record. That is obstruction of justice. That is criminal destruction of federal records. She's not wrong. Nobody has ever seriously argued she's wrong on the law. Nobody was ever charged under it either. 53 years later, in the same hearing, she said it plainly. No one was ever imprisoned for the destruction, and the victims never received formal compensation. Say that next to White's letter, next to Gottlieb's medal, next to Helms's fine, and you've got the same shape one more time, just stated out loud, on camera, in a hearing room, by a sitting member of Congress, with absolutely nothing behind the statement in the way of an actual consequence. Here's the story of how any of this survived at all, and it's a better story than we gave you credit for back in episode 4. In 1977, an archivist, just doing his job, complying with a routine Freedom of Information Act request, stumbled onto 7 boxes that had been misfiled and had escaped the fire entirely by pure administrative accident. Not a whistleblower, not a hero, a clerk following a checklist, opening a drawer that was supposed to be empty of anything relevant and finding it wasn't. Inside them, institution names, sub-project names, the actual researchers who'd taken the money, listed plainly, the way you'd expect any government grant to be documented if nobody had ever tried to hide it. From those 7 boxes alone, historians eventually reconstructed the shape of the whole operation. 149 sub-projects, more than 80 institutions, 185 outside researchers who took CIA money without necessarily knowing where it came from, some of whom presumably still don't know, or didn't live long enough to find out. Everything in this 5-part series, Olson, Cameron, White, the whole thing, exists because a records clerk in 1977 filed something in the wrong drawer. Not because the system worked, not because oversight caught it, because it failed to fail completely, by accident, one time, and nobody's ever been able to replicate that accident on purpose since. Think about how thin that thread actually is. One filing error in one government office in one specific year stands between everything you've heard across this entire series and total, permanent silence. If that clerk had done the job correctly, if those 7 boxes had gone into the same fire as everything else, this series would not exist. There would be nothing to tell you. Frank Olson would still be an unexplained suicide. Cameron would still be an unremarked upon pioneer. White would just be a retired narcotics agent nobody thought twice about. The only reason any of it is public is a mistake nobody intended to make. Now here's where this gets genuinely strange and genuinely current. A former CIA operations officer named James Erdman III testified, first in May, to a Senate committee, then again at this June hearing, that roughly 40 boxes of files, JFK assassination material and MKUltra material together, were pulled out of the office of the Director of National Intelligence while they were literally in the process of being declassified, pulled by the CIA itself from an office that was supposed to be releasing them to the public mid-process, without the kind of explanation you'd expect for something that dramatic. Erdman called it documented efforts to circumvent oversight. Luna pushed back on one word specifically. She said it was not a raid, but she didn't walk back the core claim that records were removed mid-process from the office meant to be setting them free. The CIA and the Director of National Intelligence's own office both disputed the framing too, without offering a fully alternative account of what did happen to those boxes. Where the truth actually sits in that gap between circumvented oversight and not a raid is, as far as we can tell, still unresolved as of this recording. And then, Erdman said the sentence that should stop you cold. He doesn't believe the research ever actually stopped. Sit with the source of that sentence for a second. This isn't a conspiracy blogger or an anonymous internet account. This is a man who, by his own testimony, worked inside this exact apparatus, standing in front of a congressional committee under oath in 2026, telling elected officials that a program this series has just spent 4 episodes documenting as officially dead since 1973 might, in his professional judgment, never have actually ended at all. Whatever you make of that claim, it did not come from nowhere. We're going to handle that claim exactly the way we've handled every uncertain claim across this entire series. We're telling you it was said, under testimony, by a man with direct agency experience. And we're telling you it has not been independently proven. He also testified about an alleged CIA facility in Germany where MKUltra subjects were tortured. Again, an allegation made at a public hearing, not a confirmed historical fact we can hand you as settled. We're including both because they belong in a complete account of what's actually being said about this program right now in 2026, not because we're telling you to believe them outright. Stephen Kinzer testified too, the historian whose work anchors most of this series. The same book we told you at the start we were building this whole thing from. He put it in a phrase that's going to stick with you. Gottlieb, he said, operated with something close to a license to kill issued by his own government, and got away with it using what Kinzer called cutouts, universities and foundations that let the agency's fingerprints stay off almost everything. The exact mechanism we walked you through back in episode 1, still being explained to Congress 50 years later as though it were new information, because for most of the people in that room, it still is. And then Kinzer said the part that turns this from history into a warning aimed directly at the present. Modern neuroscience, modern cyber tools, modern AI have handed any agency that wanted to try this again capabilities Gottlieb himself couldn't have dreamed of in 1953, when the state-of-the-art was still Cointreau spiked with acid at a cabin in Maryland. Tom O'Neill, testifying alongside him, agreed. arguing it's unlikely that decades of research and investment in this exact capability would simply have been abandoned once the name MKUltra became radioactive. Programs don't usually die because their name becomes a punchline. They usually just change their name and keep going under a quieter one. Investigators at this same hearing referenced a declassified memo read into the record that described in clinical, almost bureaucratic language how a real memory could be replaced with a fabricated one under hypnosis. Convincing enough that the subject would come to believe the invented version had actually happened to them, and the true one hadn't. 70 years old, and it reads less like a historical curiosity and more like a spec sheet somebody could still build from. One more live thread, and it's the strangest one. Luna announced, mid-hearing, that the CIA is in the process of declassifying newly discovered documents connected to something she called a forgery program that had apparently been housed under the MKUltra umbrella. She didn't explain what that means. Nobody at that hearing got a straight answer about what was forged, or why, or for what purpose, or who it was used against. As of this recording, that's still an open box, literally and figuratively. A folder with a label and nothing else attached to it yet, dangled in front of a room full of cameras and left there. We should tell you, in the interest of the same fairness we've tried to bring to every claim across this whole series, that not everyone watching that hearing thinks it was a clean pursuit of the truth. Critics, including the National Security Archive, an organization that has spent decades actually filing the FOIA requests that produced most of what's public about this program, called it more spectacle than substance. They point out that Luna spent real hearing time asking a witness whether USAID might have been secretly used overseas on prisoners of war, a theory she offered no direct evidence for at all, and that the same task force has previously used hearings on subjects like this one to gesture toward vaccine conspiracy theories that have nothing to do with the actual historical record we've spent 5 episodes walking you through. That's a real, documented criticism made publicly by people who study this material professionally, and we're not going to pretend it doesn't exist just because it complicates a tidy finale. Some of what's happening in Congress right now looks like genuine accountability, 50 years overdue. Some of it looks like theater wearing accountability's clothes, borrowing the moral weight of real victims to sell an unrelated argument. From here, in real time, watching it unfold the same week we're recording this, it is genuinely hard to tell which parts are which, and we'd be lying to you if we pretended otherwise. So here's where we actually leave you, because this series was never going to get you a bow on top, and we told you that in episode 1. We told you 5 episodes ago that nobody was ever punished for MKUltra. That's still true. It's true after the Church Committee. It's true after Helms's fine. It's true after a congresswoman called it obstruction of justice and criminal destruction of federal records on live television in 2026, 53 years after the fact, with absolutely zero legal consequence attached to saying it out loud. Naming a crime, it turns out, is not the same thing as prosecuting one. This entire series has been a demonstration of exactly that gap, over and over, in 5 different rooms, across 3 different generations, on 2 different continents. What we can tell you, honestly, is this: the file is not closed. New boxes are still turning up. New witnesses are still testifying. A man who worked for this agency stood up this year and said, on the record, that he doesn't think it ever actually stopped. We don't know if he's right. Nobody watching that hearing knew either. Not the critics calling it theater, Not the congresswoman calling it justice. Not us, sitting here telling you about it days later, with a search engine open in another tab, checking whether anything had changed since we wrote this sentence. Frank Olson went through a window in 1953, for reasons his own government spent 22 years lying about. 73 years later, people are still standing up in front of microphones, trying to find out exactly how far that lie actually went, and they still don't fully know. That's not a satisfying place to end a story. It's just the honest one. And this entire series has been about exactly one thing, said 5 different ways in 5 different decades. What happens to people, and to the truth, when institutions get to decide for themselves how much of either one anybody ever gets to see? 60 years ago, that institution was the CIA, deciding what a hotel room really contained. Today, it's still the CIA, deciding what's inside 40 boxes nobody outside Langley has actually opened. The building changed hands a few times. The instinct never did.